Talking Together About Guns is made possible by the Penn State College of Communications, the College of Liberal Arts Department of Communication Arts and Sciences, the Rock Ethics Institute, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us for this live discussion of Peace Officer, which is part of a series of events at Penn State and wpsu called Talking Together About Guns. I'm Dr. Matt Jordan, Associate Professor of Media Studies in the College of Communications at Penn State. Each year, over 30,000 Americans are killed by guns. A small portion of these, around 1,000, are at the hands of the police. Yet looking at the sensational images you see on television and listening to the rhetoric our politicians use, you might think that America is spinning out of control. In fact, it is not. The facts tell us America is getting less violent, but some would have you believe otherwise. This is a dangerous misperception. There's perhaps no better symbol of our collective response, one conditioned by an inflamed fear of violent crime, than the subject of our discussion today, SWAT teams. Despite a steady drop in violent crime over the last 30 years, SWAT raids have grown exponentially. Is the increased use of SWAT tactics and ordnance a symptom of our misperception of danger? If so, what are ways that we can get back on track and work toward de-escalation and more reasonable tactics for keeping the peace? The first step toward solving any problem is by talking it through and finding common ground as we search together for solutions. Tonight, we have a panel of experts with experience as peace officers who can help us start that conversation. Let's meet our guests. William Dub Lawrence, a retired police officer and sheriff who is the detective protagonist in Peace Officer. Tim Stringer, a longtime law enforcement officer and expert who works with the PSU Justice and Safety Institute to train local law enforcement in tactical response techniques. And Tracy Small, the coordinator of the Center County Crisis Intervention Team, which helps to create dialogue and conversation between the behavioral health system and the criminal justice system. Thank you all for joining us. Dub, I want to start by asking you how you came to make this film.
The 22nd of September, 2008, my son-in-law was shot by a SWAT team that I founded. I began putting together, trying to find the truth because I didn't feel like what was presented to the media, to millions of people initially for 20-some hours was accurate. I was there, I witnessed, I saw it. I knew that what was put out was not accurate. I wanted to know the truth, and so did my family members and friends and community at large. I set about to try to find what I could. It took me 2 years and 7 months to get some of the footage that was included in the film. During that time, actually 4 years after I started that, in 2012, I met Scott Christopherson, who was a filmmaker from Austin, Texas, at a softball game with my son. And we were introduced and we talked about the evidence and the materials that I collected. And he put that thought forth of maybe doing a full-length documentary. He was a film professor. He had a friend at Brigham Young University, Brad Barber, and the two of them talked about it and decided that we could have some societal impact if we were to put together a documentary film. So I spent the next 22 months, almost 2 years, working with them and having them follow me with cameras on 5 different investigations that we had targeted as problematic. And so we included those in the film, documentary film, Peace Officer. It was released in March of 2015 at the South by Southwest Film Festival. We were excited and surprised in a way because it took audience preference and grand jury first place at that festival. And since then, I've been trying to give a voice to people, victims, families that don't have a voice. So that's in brief.
So these kind of tactics, as the film shows, were originally a response to urban crime starting in the 1970s. And they have been on the rise since the 1970s, these tactics. One of the interesting things that I found while researching this is that violent crime has been decreasing since then. In 2013, for instance, there were fewer violent crimes than any year since 1978. So despite that, we've seen an increase in the number of uses of these types of tactics. And how might you account for that discrepancy?
Actually, you could give some credit to the idea that SWAT teams and tactical units and police, the war on crime, the war on drugs, hundreds of thousands of people who had committed crimes are now in prison, in our prison system. The rate of recidivism obviously is decreased if people are dead or in prison. I think that would have an impact, and I think that's kind of a police perspective. From the standpoint of victims, there's been a significant rise in the number of officer-involved shootings, a number of deaths that could be classified as unnecessary loss of life, both sides, law enforcement and the public. So the statistics, you can do all kinds of statistical scenarios, but I think to give some understanding of that complex issue, the idea of looking at solutions to where we are. I personally think that we got on the wrong track about 1982 when we declared all-out war on crime, and politicians started saying tough on crime, 3 strikes you're out, mandatory sentencing. So all the system has gradually evolved into a broken system. In a certain sense, there are so many injustices being created today, and the public doesn't really have the truth. And in the era that I began law enforcement many, many years ago, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth was predominantly the way we approached things. Investigations were completed with the idea of learning the truth and then using our system of government through due process to prosecute those guilty and punish them, and to free those people or have those people who were not guilty cleared by the same process. So our whole system has deteriorated, I think, not only from the judicial standpoint. Judges are more administrators of the law than they used to be. Police officers are more militaristic than they used to be. Rather than peace officer, they're more trained and used in warlike situations. And I think there's a distinct difference between the way peace officers in a civilian society should function. And I think we've merged the two concepts of the wars that we have: war on crime, war on drugs, war on pornography, war on terror. We've merged 2 different roles, and it's having a detrimental effect on our society. So now we have people polarized to the point to where officers are getting shot by people because of injustices that have been created on both sides.
Tim, this is a question for you as somebody who trains people in these types of tactics throughout the Pennsylvania area. These seem to be a response to crime that is supposed to be very visible, that's part of its impact, maybe dating back to the 1970s when there was so much visible crime that this was a reaction to that. Do you think that those very visible, overwhelming force tactics are helpful for the police in terms of the public perception of the role?
Looking at what law enforcement does with training and preparing for these situations, the idea, the concept isn't to go in and be as violent as we can. There's times and places that we have to do that. And the sheriff chief, whatever he was in the video, the movie, Chief Winder, kind of talked about that. When you look at what law enforcement officers have to go through, they're dealing with things that are tense, rapidly evolving, and uncertain. They're going in with the training that they have, the experiences that they have, and they're trying to make a difference, and they're trying to do that as best they can. Okay. The last thing anyone wants to do is when they go to work is have to take another human being's life.
Right. So the film is making the case that a lot of the in a way, there's a favorite Napoleon quote of mine, which is one becomes the man of one's uniform, right? And the 1033 program, which gave military ordnance to local police throughout the country. I think I looked at it since 2006, about 800 armored vehicles have been distributed, 400 aircraft, 93,000 machine guns, and Pennsylvania itself has gotten $11.5 million of it. Does that dressing up in relation to war change the police officers that you've worked with?
No, not at all. When you look at the perception of law enforcement officers, SWAT, being on a SWAT team in Center County, we call it a tactical response team. Being a member of that organization is an honor. There's a selection process. It's rather rigorous. The training that we go through is rather rigorous. The last thing that we want to do is make ourselves look bad. When you look at the 1033 program, it's one of those things that's out there to help us. If in the local area, if we didn't have the 1033 program, our agencies were going to have to purchase the rifles that we ended up getting. When you look at the 1033 program, it's something that helps us. If you look back in February of 1997, February 28th of 97, the Bank of America gunfight that went down New York or Los Angeles. The LAPD, one of the most well-organized agencies in the country, ended up having to reach out and get armored cars that were in the area. This is eliminating that process. We're not using these things unless we absolutely have to. Just because we wear the tactical uniform doesn't make us soldiers. We follow rules. The military has rules of engagement. We don't have that. We have Pennsylvania law. We have the U.S. Constitution. We have the Pennsylvania Constitution. And we got case law. And those are the things that we, as police officers, as trainers, we focus on those things and we understand those things. We understand Graham versus Connor, which is the case from the 1980s. It's still the beacon case of use of force for law enforcement. Tennessee versus Gardner is another case. Those are the things that we train on, we practice, we focus our decision making on with those particular things. So there's a lot going on our side of this.
Sure. Tracy, do you, in your work as a behavioral psychologist, working with both police and with people who have been, I assume, at the other end of this, have you seen a response to people coming in these types of uniforms and with the tactical gear, assault rifles, tanks? Is there a psychological effect on people that you've seen in your work?
Certainly there is, and part of what we do during our training, when we're training law enforcement on crisis de-escalation, is to have people with mental health diagnoses come in and speak to the class as we're doing the trainings. And this sort of helps to break down the barrier between law enforcement in a uniform and folks who have mental health disorders. And it allows police officers the opportunity to see folks who do have mental health disorders when they're doing well in their recovery, and it allows those folks who have mental health disorders to see police out of uniform and understand that they want to have a better understanding of what's going on with someone when they are experiencing a crisis situation. So in our community in the last 6 years that we've been doing crisis intervention training, we've definitely seen that shift and people feeling more comfortable whenever they are approached with law enforcement.
Right. I wonder, as a follow-up to that, with these tactics being so visible and so loud, and what does this do to people? Since I know a lot of the percentage of times that these things are used are with, as is in the case in the film, are with people who are going through some kind of psychic crisis or psychological crisis. What is their response to being presented with this type of overwhelming force?
Well, honestly, I haven't really seen that much in Center County. Certainly, police presence alone, I think, people tend to get a little more anxious, a little more nervous. And part of what we do in training is to teach officers to take the time to really slow down and understand what's going on with the individual in crisis, to ask a few more questions so that they can understand that the officer is also a human being as well and does want to help that person be guided towards the best outcome in that situation.
In the film, we see that people want to examine outcomes of the tactical strike forces, and this is a big issue that the film is dealing with, is getting to the bottoms of these. Like you said, one of the reasons you made the film. And yet we see a lot of shutting down of that natural desire to know what's going on. Do you have any sense of why that is a communication strategy that is employed, to kind of redact the conversation?
That's always been a problem for me, and I've been fighting that issue when I was a police officer in the county sheriff and the county commissioner. Those issues began to come up when we declared war, and the mentality, the labeling, the divisiveness that began to take place as police unions. I'm going to be a little bit of an adversary here to my own profession, which I have tremendous respect for, and I'm not talking about 80% of the profession. I'm talking about what we're experiencing that causes this problems in our society. And that is when the police unions can get legislators to pass laws that favor the police and protect the police from scandal. For example, police immunity. Police have qualified immunity under the law now. So if you examine most of the cases where there is a problem with an officer-involved shooting, you find that the officers are not treated on the same level in our due process system as regular citizens are. And it's offensive to a lot of citizens when an officer is shown, or most of the evidence indicates that the officer used bad judgment or it was a bad call, as in several of the cases in the film, where it was even determined to be unjustified. The police have protections built into the law, and governmental immunity has been one of my targets for a long time. I think plea bargaining helped to bring us to that point. Those are things that were determined to be necessary at some point in our involvement. But plea bargaining, when politicians ran for public office being tough on crime, and they passed mandatory sentencing laws, that created, in my judgment, as many problems as it solved. When they decided to, push the idea of 3 strikes you're out, that put overload in our correction systems. Our jails and our prisons are bursting at the seams and basically bankrupted the state of California. It's the largest department in California's government, is the corrections department. And so we have 2.8 million people of our society imprisoned behind bars, and a large percentage of those are nonviolent criminals, are there because the laws that have been passed in the last 20, 30 years have led us to the point that we are. And so there's some huge negative impacts that makes it wonderful to have this kind of a dialogue, because we can hopefully find some solutions that will make it better for both sides, so we have less officers killed in line of duty, and we have less citizens killed unnecessarily. So the blowback that you get from citizens, victims, now it's into the hundreds of thousands of people families, relatives, friends, cousins, aunts, uncles, who have witnessed injustices from a family member by the police. And you've got modern technology, you've got video, proof, evidence of abuses of power, bullies with badges and guns. There is no place, in my judgment, for that kind of a person to be employed as a peace officer. Right. But on the other hand, the system has allowed officers to have a lot of discretionary power that we didn't have years ago. And so I fault the law that enables people, officers, government employees that have either qualified immunity or absolute immunity. I fault, for example, Freedom of Information Act, FOIA. When we refer to that law, if you read it carefully and look at its impact on the country, it's a misnomer. It makes the public think that we can get information that we're entitled to under the Constitution. But in reality, the law makes it possible for the government to keep information from the public. And so if we're an ignorant, uninformed society, we cannot, as citizens, even make reasonable, logical decisions in the choosing of our leaders and knowing who to support and who not to, or what to think when a case is actually investigated. In the case in Ogden with the 5 officers that were wounded and 1 that was killed by Matthew David Stewart, that investigation revealed clearly that 2 of the officers were shot in crossfire. That makes a lot of officers mad, and it puts me in the hot water to say that, but I know that for a fact and was able to find the evidence to show and prove that. But the rules of law, criminal procedure, rules of criminal procedure, rules of civil procedure, keep that information out of the courtroom. We got all that evidence and presented it to the court in that case, in the civil case that followed. But you can't use it because under the rules of civil procedure and criminal procedure, that evidence is inadmissible because it's contaminated.
Sure, sure.
So we got to follow the rules. And I respect the rule of law. And the judges have to respect the rule of law. They have to rule in accordance with the law. So I fault our lawmakers who pass laws that they don't even read sometimes, and make us as citizens responsible to those laws. So that's where I focus my attention.
So Tim, as you train sheriffs and people throughout, how do you deal with this issue of how to deal with the blowback of these things? Are you trying to develop better communication so you can get to transparency?
Absolutely. Within the last probably 6 months, and I don't remember all the names of the organizations, but I know the International Association of the Chief of Police, the National Tactical Officers Association, there were 11 altogether. They actually came up with a proposal, and all it's really doing is taking the existing things and reinforcing our options with verbal command or verbal direction, engaging in that verbal dialogue. Tracy's a part of the CIT program here in Center County. We've been doing it for a while. For a lot of our folks, they were reluctant going in, but once they got there, like, this is what we've been doing.
Right.
And what's happening locally in Center County isn't necessarily the same thing that's going on across the country.
That's true.
But we actually have a pretty good relationship where we're slowing things down. We're talking to people. On the TAC team call-outs, when the tactical response team is coming out, we try to get CRT the CIT involved in that as well. But there's times and places that doesn't work, and then we have to do things. It's a last resort, though. It's an absolute last resort. We try to train people, whether it's us at Justice and Safety with the deputy sheriffs, or it's municipal police or Pennsylvania State Police. You know, we try to de-escalate things. The last thing that we want to do is do something that's gonna, if you take another human being's life, it's gonna live with you forever. Yeah. You change after that, and we don't want that to happen. We train them to make good decisions. We train them to think tactically. We train them to slow things down, take a deep cleansing breath. In the Sheriff's Academy, we're using a program right now called Cognitive Command, where they're code words that we use, and we talk about TAC talk, and we use those techniques to have the deputies make good decisions, make good tactical decisions, and think about things to try to de-escalate the situation rather than actually escalate it.
As you've watched the increase of these use of tactics, as somebody who teaches this in an academic setting, how is the law enforcement education system responded to best practices in terms of these things?
As I said, initially it was a little reluctant.
Okay.
But once we started talking about it, and the seasoned officers that have been on the job for a while, we've been doing this for all our careers. We just didn't call it this.
Right.
The new officers that are coming on board, like, oh, this makes sense. I can understand this, and it's been very well received.
And what are locally, or not exactly locally, but throughout the area that when are these types of tactics used? What are the situations when these are called for?
The de-escalation tactics, every single situation that we deal with.
I'm talking about the
tactical response.
Tactical response.
Here in Center County, and we've kind of adopted this from the National Tactical Officers Association, is we actually have a forum that it's a rubric, and there has to be so many points for the team to be activated. If we don't rise to that level, the team is not activated. And we don't use them just for every drug arrest. Right. There has to be something more involved. There has to be weapons involved. There has to be somebody with a past violent history, resisting, things that are going to make it more dangerous for us as law enforcement. That's when the TAC team gets called out. If we don't have that level, TAC team doesn't come out.
I see. And the strategies, Tracy, the strategies of de-escalation that you teach, communication obviously has to be a big part of that as well. What do you try and get into the officers' minds as you kind of prep them for these types of situations?
I think just real life situations that they've been in and how they could have handled those situations maybe a little more effectively to have a more peaceful resolution. the mindset, it's a 40-hour training that we provide. It's pretty intensive, and it starts out in the beginning of the week, educating the class on mental health issues, co-occurring disorders, people who have substance abuse disorders and mental health disorders. And we talk a lot about post-traumatic stress disorder. We see a lot of our veterans coming back from overseas who have post-traumatic stress disorders. And I think a big part of our training is hearing from individuals who have mental health disorders as well as their families. NAMI, which is the National Alliance on Mental Illness, is a big part of our training, and they share their stories about their loved ones and their interactions maybe that they had that weren't so positive with law enforcement. And I think hearing that and going through the scenarios that we have at the end of the week, which are based on actual 911 calls that we've had right here in Centre County, I think all of that compiled, that 40 hours by the end of the week, officers leave there feeling much better prepared to go out and handle de-escalation, having the de-escalation tactics to handle those situations. And it doesn't just have to be someone who's having a mental health crisis. It could be used, the skills can be used for somebody who, maybe they're in a car accident and they're worked up, and officers can go out and, like Tim said, they can just slow things down, talk to that person, ask a few more questions, find out what's going on, and help redirect them to the help that they need instead of criminalizing mental health disorders and having people end up going through the criminal justice system.
And Deb, you've obviously been traveling the country with the film and just doing public speaking. Have you seen similar responses in areas, or is it just very hit and miss in terms of where we're getting responses that are designed to de-escalate, or are you seeing areas where it's less prevalent?
I think on the front end, what Tim is saying is, and what's being stated here is absolutely correct. And the training is wonderful. The attempt to learn proper procedures. What I'm seeing almost across the board is where there's bad judgment, where there is a mistake that's made, where we're seeing injustice. We see the blowback coming from victims, families, survivors, not being able to find out what really happened and find out the truth. It's kept from them, redacted, or the information, and for legal reasons, through the trial. But often there are instances where the police were absolutely wrong, and one of the protections, one of the defenses in the immunity, qualified immunity, is if it would result in a scandal, and in lots of cases that would be scandalous, and some of the things were revealed. Those things are protected, and the injustices that victims, families feel, there's no closure, there's no understanding, there's no access to the truth. And so our best efforts, officers that handle cases properly or train properly and exercise those, by far and away, they work, and that's what I'm saying, that my smile always works better than my .357 Magnum. There are lots of ways of diffusing and neutralizing without, in some of these cases where the county attorney actually authorized the use of deadly force. In my son-in-law's case, there were 3 county attorneys and an FBI negotiator that wasn't used on the scene. And so to make a conscious decision, we've been here long enough, it's time to end this. And the police chief, as you saw in the film, that's a news release after 22 hours. That's when he acknowledged that only 1 shot was fired. There's 111 shots fired. The question was, how many shots were fired? That's not a correct answer, and it's misleading. It's misinformation. It's a spin. It's the latest terminology is alternative facts. I mean, it's ridiculous that we as a society have to guess what happened and not know when something goes wrong. And of the 29 cases that I investigated over the past, since 2008, 5 of them were problematic. To me, that's too high of a percentage to tolerate, to allow to continue. We have to address some of these issues that are causing unnecessary loss of life and blowback that people are actually ambushing police officers. There's so much injustice that's occurred. We're getting some really serious impact in our society.
Right.
When we have 20 suicides per day from veterans, when we have families that are protesting, we don't want to have burning and looting and demonstrations that result in violence and other innocent people damaged and hurt. If we can, through dialogue like this, to reach some positive solutions to some of these, we need to revisit some of those mistakes we made and correct them. And we need to chart a course. One of the things I would recommend, I really like what Wisconsin has done. There's a friend of mine that has sponsored, his son was killed by the police. He was in handcuffs and the officer shot him in the temple in handcuffs on the hood of his car. But Michael Bell has spoken to Congress. He's been an advocate. He spent everything that he received in the $2 million plus settlement that he got for wrongful death, trying to help people understand a way to correct and make amends. I don't like the idea that we as police officers investigate our own crimes. If we police ourselves, we're obviously going to be biased. I don't like that. I think the solution is the pattern that is good, that I really like, is used by the Federal Aviation Administration. When there's a crash, when a pilot crashes a plane, there is a thorough investigation, an independent investigation, and we learn from the mistakes that were made. It may be pilot error, and the pilot may never get to fly again, or it may be malfunction of some equipment, it may be weather, it may be someone in the terminal. Somebody made a mistake, and they look at what caused it, how we got here, and what we can do to fix it. So we have developed the safest system of travel in the world, with rules that hold people accountable. And we, rather than targeting and blaming, we look at and evaluate and find solutions that will work better. And I think law enforcement as a profession needs to move toward the pattern example that's been set by the Federal Aviation Administration and the National Transportation Safety Board.
Right. If you're just joining us, I'm Matt Jordan, and this is our discussion of Peace Officer, part of our ongoing series Talking Together About Guns. Let me reintroduce our guests. William Dub Lawrence, a retired police officer and sheriff who is the detective protagonist in Peace Officer. Tim Stringer, a longtime law enforcement officer and expert who works with the Penn State Justice and Safety Institute to train law enforcement in tactical response techniques. And Tracy Small, the coordinator of the Center County Crisis Intervention Team, which helps to create dialogue and conversation between the behavioral health system and the criminal justice system. Tim, one of the claims the movie makes is that that law enforcement who get ordinance through the 1033 feel compelled to use it. Is that something that you've seen in your experience?
Not at all. We get the equipment, we are required to use it, and that means nothing more than implementing into your table of organization.
Okay.
Taking the rifles to the range and certifying and training and qualifying your people so they know how to use it. The same with the armored vehicles, the same with boats, the same with gas masks, the helmets. Getting them out, using them is that part of it. It's not, okay, this looks like, well, we got to use them, let's go ahead and raid this house. That's not how it works, not in any way, shape, or form.
Okay. There's a question from the audience. What is the total amount of dollar investment in the training of police for SWAT equipments in this area?
Locally, you're looking at somewhere, the low end's probably $30,000, probably up to $60,000, depending on how long the person's on the team.
Mm-hmm. Tracy, one of the things that it strikes me that Dub was talking about is this mistrust between the public as in response to these types of conditions, right? The violence is exacted and that leads to response. What is the justification from your perspective, as somebody working with kind of straddling this? Why not just say, let's not use these tactics?
The de-escalation tactics?
Or no, as somebody who's dealt with this behaviorally and whatnot, does somebody make the case that we just shouldn't use these types of SWAT tactics?
I'm sure there are people out there that make that case, but I think the more that we've moved forward with our training here in Center County, and I try to do as many interviews like this as I can to make it known to our community that we do have this type of training, and we are really working to make sure that law enforcement officers, as well as everyone else in the criminal justice system and first responders, are receiving the same type of training. We don't just train police, we train our 911 dispatchers, we train our EMTs, our corrections officers, anybody who's likely to have contact with someone who has some sort of a behavioral health issue.
Okay. And Tim, when people go out into the field dressed in these things, is there a different response that they get from people that they interact with based on that? Some of the research that I did on this suggested, and a lot of this was the post-Ferguson stuff, saying that if you go into an area essentially dressed like you're a commando unit, that people are more likely to actually act out against it, almost in reaction to the fact that it seems like it's escalating.
We haven't seen that locally. Okay. If we show up in the gear, we tend to draw a crowd.
Okay.
But that's about it. We haven't seen any escalation with response from the consumers that we're dealing with. We haven't really seen that.
And tactically, is it good to draw a crowd, or
absolutely not?
Yeah.
The last thing we want to do is have a crowd, just for their safety. In the event something does happen, the last thing we want is additional victims.
How often are these tactics used in Pennsylvania?
I can't answer that. There's really no way to track it in Pennsylvania. The one thing that I will kind of talk about, and what I saw from the video, or the movie rather, is a lot of nighttime raids, a lot of no-knock raids, or banging on the door and gaining entry at the same time. That doesn't fly in Pennsylvania. We have to have special circumstance for a no-knock warrant.
I see.
We have to go to a judge on that warrant and ask for a no-knock warrant, and there has to be reasonable grounds for it. Even to get a search warrant at nighttime between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. requires additional approval from that judge. There has to be articulable facts, and if we don't have them, we don't get the warrants.
Okay, that seems reasonable. But in places that you've traveled to, that's not always the case, right?
That's one of the problems across the nation is different departments, different leaders have different philosophies. And when I go to an area like this place, I'm inspired, and it's possible that we can do that across the nation. You probably will see a very positive result, that you are not having the kind of mistakes, unnecessary loss of life in your community that other communities are experiencing, and from bad judgment from officers who are not trained, who don't have. There are bullies with badges and guns, and we've seen them. We've seen some officers, as many, you go through a whole career and you maybe run into one case where you are in a situation where you have to take a life. But in some of the cities, like Albuquerque, New Mexico, for example, one of the officers have killed 7 people. I mean, that should have indicated, and now that they've investigated, and the Justice Department has been in and investigated and found that 24 more cases that the police covered up, were unnecessary, unjustified. That's what I'm talking about. Those are the kind of problems in areas in the country. But we need the whole nation to be behind the idea of having the quality of training and law enforcement, accountability, responsibility, fairness, equality under the law. And Ferguson, Missouri is a bad example of policing in most people's judgment who look at that situation. The police have been abusive in some cities where the police, it's a war. There's them and there's us. We're divided and adversarial. And when the police are perceived as adversarial, and the police consider citizens as, bad people, potentially bad people, everybody, and you go prepared, and you're not courteous or friendly, or if you're disrespectful, people respond in a different manner than they do where you have qualified, professional, kind, gentle enforcement, unless it's necessary to be rough and tough. There are occasions when you have to exert force, and that's what the state has the power to do. And when you have to do that, you do it, and you do it professionally. But you don't try them, convict them, and beat them up, beat their brains out, and punish them, and then get off and have no due process, which is every citizen in every state is guaranteed due process of law. So too much discretionary power has turned out to be, in the last 30 or 40 years, a negative for our society. And it's all the way to the top. I'm sorry, but all the way to the campaign for the presidency this past, we saw instances where violence and punching somebody in the face is acceptable, and with an offer to pay the legal expenses, that's just wrong, because wealthy people, rich people, affluent people are more equal than minority people, poor people. In my state, it was in my jail, my experience was that the black kids, the Hispanic kids, the poor white kids stayed in jail. I mean, they were incarcerated. And the people who were wealthy, they had a lawyer, they posted bail, and they plea bargained something, and they never saw him again. So that injustice does exist. We cannot turn our backs on that. There is injustices that are bringing about a divisiveness in our society that doesn't have to be. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to address that.
Do you worry that the more we talk about things like law and order as an us and them, that I was recently reading where down in the South that they were considering making resisting arrest a felony. Does this type of thing exacerbate this kind of cycle of violence?
Yeah, because it depends on the psychological condition of the subject that you run into. Mm-hmm. If a person's impaired, I told my deputies, look, don't you ever beat up a drunk. Mm-hmm. I mean, the reason it's against the law is because they're impaired. Their judgment is impaired. Some people fight, some people want to make love. I mean, if they're drunk, they're impaired. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's like different. You have to respond to the actual circumstance that there is. But if an officer punishes a person all the way to the jail and it is rough, or hits them with a stick, or twists their arm behind their back, or clamps the handcuffs on too tight, and gives them a lecture and tells them they're going to suffer, that's not due process. It's not what an officer's job is. And so those people who go beyond what their duty and sworn oath of office is, actually, I can't forget it. It's something it's imprinted in my brain forever. I swore in over 100 officers and deputies and personnel that I trained, and I made them take an oath that's different than most law enforcement officers take, and I think I had that prerogative as a sheriff. As a law enforcement officer, my fundamental duty is to serve mankind, to safeguard lives and property, to protect the innocent from deception, the weak against oppression or intimidation, the peaceful against violence or disorder, and to respect the constitutional rights of all persons to liberty, equality, and justice. I solemnly swear or affirm that I will support, obey, defend the Constitution of the United States of America and the state of Utah, and discharge my duty with fidelity. Now, all of that's not necessary under the Constitution, but it was necessary for my officers to have a commitment to the profession that would make sure that they treated people with respect. You treat people with dignity, they will usually respond better. When you have a suspect that will help you roll his fingerprints at the jail, you've sold the arrest. I mean, if you have one that is belligerent and bleeding, and we have to take him to the hospital on the way to the jail because an officer beat him with a stick, that's not necessary. But that's where we are in lots of places in our country, and that's what we're trying to avoid.
So, Tim, as you studied this probably as a social phenomena, what are instances as you watch the media, because and we see a lot of this in the media, and part of it's just because it's so spectacular. News can't stay away from it. We see it more in television shows that it didn't used to be a thing. Now it's 3 or 4 times a year on Law and Order. What are instances of this, as you see it in the national news, where this is just the wrong way to go about it?
The TAC team application of it?
Yeah. Because we see them in like crowd control, we see them in things like that. Where
the problem that we're running into, and for me to sit here and judge other law enforcement officers, is I don't know the laws of those particular states. You look at the U.S. Constitution, it's in place. We look at the Fourth Amendment. In Pennsylvania, we have Article 1, Section 8 that's kind of the equivalent to that. I can't really put my finger on one thing. This is where we did something wrong because I wasn't there. When you look at the law enforcement side of this, there's a perspective. When you look at the situations that he's addressed through his investigations, there's that family involvement, that family perception, even though there was other things going on. The son was selling drugs. That's okay, but what the cops did was wrong. And I understand that. But when you look at what's taking place, there's times and places for certain things to go on. And in a lot of these circumstances, whether it's the examples from the video or examples here in Center County, Pennsylvania, Texas, Oklahoma, wherever, we have a situation where law enforcement officers are going in. They know going in that in today's day and age, technology is everywhere. We used to call Big Brother watching. Big Brother's watching everyone, to include law enforcement now. So we've got the cameras that we're wearing on our body armor, if we have them. The cameras from the people in the environment, the surveillance cameras for businesses, the transportation cameras. Those resources are kind of making us, it's not one of those things that it's, they're looking over our shoulder, we've got to do the right thing. We're doing the right thing because it is the right thing.
Well, maybe I'll ask you a similar question, Tracy. Have you seen instances in national news or whatnot that you look at those and say, that probably wasn't a good idea, they shouldn't have gone in that way, this could have been handled by people going in as plainclothes, or not as plainclothes, but as plain uniformed police?
Certainly, and even as I watched the film, one of the things that we talk about in our training is the idea of a solid object theory, and that is that when people are in an emotional state, an elevated emotional state, they tend to gravitate towards someone who they feel comfortable with, who can keep them grounded and help them get through that crisis. And certainly I just saw bits and pieces from the film, but there was one point where Brian's father was standing at the truck and engaging in conversation with him. And I questioned myself when I saw the film as to whether or not that was his solid object theory, and whether or not it would have been helpful to allow that conversation between Brian and his father to continue, because it could have been helping him to de-escalate at that point. So
a best practice might be find somebody that can maybe break that division between the law enforcement and the person who's they're responding to, that can be a kind of liaison between those two.
Sure, yeah.
And do you take that type of evidence as you know?
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
I agree with that. But one of the things the command staff, the officers that were there, if they let the father stay and something happens to the father, he's already fired one round into as soon as the officers got there. If the officers let him stay and something happens to him, there's that liability associated with that. So they had to make a tactical decision. Do we let him stay and continue the grounding, which may have been a good idea, or are they concerned about his individual safety and pulling him out? There were some things in that particular scenario that I don't necessarily agree with or don't quite understand. But again, we're only seeing clips of it and not the entire thing. When you look at this from the law enforcement perspective, there are things that are going on, whether it's the TAC team officers, the officers on the perimeter, the command staff. They're getting information. They're using what they know at the time to factor into their decision making, and that's what they're doing. If there's ulterior motives, those things need to be addressed. But if there's not, they're dealing with what they're doing. And the courts tell us, the case law tells us, that we have to be reasonable in our actions for what we know at the time. And if you look at any of those scenarios, could they have done things better? The no-knock warrants was really one of the things that caused some of those issues. Right. And we can address that by having our checks and balances where the courts are telling us you can't do that, or you have to do it at a certain time period, or you have to knock, wait for a short period of time. There has to be something special for us to do a no-knock warrant.
Okay. So you're presented in the film, I think, in a really interesting way as as a system fixer, right? That you're somebody who goes in and looks at systems,
sewage pumps,
and plant irrigation. But as somebody who's interested in fixing systems, and in this case, a system that the film seems to argue has gotten off the rails, what would be some best practices or common sense practices that we might, as a society, employ for trying to de-escalate the situation?
Okay, I would start with teaching, training, trying to influence the public, the general public, that it's not a good idea to aggravate the police officers with a video camera, or I think it's escalating when a person refuses to comply, that is taught, trained, and we've in the last few years, people like to assert their perceived authority, to challenge authority, their right to challenge authority. I think some of these TV shows, Cop Block, for example, where they show videos of people who challenge authority. Am I under arrest? Am I being detained? Asserting their constitutional rights, supposedly, and quite often the officers are hoodwinked into not wanting to get on YouTube, with a situation that's, where they are proven to be violating somebody's constitutional rights. I think the social media, we need to police change that. I think we need to look at training people that's not really, that's somebody's interpretation of the Constitution. Mm-hmm. But there's not a lot of basis for that. There are laws, there's court decisions that tell people that unless you are a suspect in a criminal activity or an officer has a suspicion that you're breaking a law. But I watch some of these and I see a number of violations. If this were to happen in my county, the guy is walking down the street with a AK-47 strapped to his back, and some mother on her way to school with her children calls in, and you've got a situation where the officer comes out, and all he's doing is trying to provoke something that will get a police officer there so he can get him on video with a showdown where he's asserting his rights to not comply. Well, I see that, and I've watched that video, and I say, okay, first of all, he's walking on the wrong side of the road. That's a violation of the traffic code, Utah traffic code. He's demonstrating, with showing people on a public roadway that he has a right to keep and bear arms. Mm-hmm. Okay, he's middle of the day. You're disturbing the peace because you've got a lady who is terrified because you just had Sandy Hook in elementary schools, and you're a mile and a half from the elementary school, and he's walking in the direction with an automatic weapon. All of these circumstances that I see on some of these videos, I would list all of the violations, including, as an officer, I have a prerogative I have certainly valid feelings and could, if I wanted to, exert some discretionary power and have reason to believe that he's a nutcase and needs to be committed. So we have laws on the books. We've got 20,000 laws in Utah, and you have that many in Pennsylvania probably. And we have county ordinances, we have city ordinances, we have codes, and there are so many laws that you can't even walk outdoors without breaking one, basically speaking. There's approximately 92,000 federal laws. And so it's hard for me to understand or even comprehend that an officer can't see something. If the person is belligerent, there's conduct that's punishable by law. You've got several catch-all laws that an officer can use to get that risk, that person, and justify it in court. But my duty, my responsibility in my county was to protect everybody in my community. And if I've got a nutcase who wants to demonstrate his interpretation of the Second Amendment rights, there's 20 reasons that I could come up with under the law to get him off the street, and hopefully teach him that what he's doing is creating a problem for the community. And so those kinds of confrontations that have now become wonderful, you know, to get on YouTube, to get popularity. We've got a problem with the use of social media that
Tim,
is creating a problem.
Tim, if I were to ask you, if you were king for a day and you could do anything you wanted to change the way that these things were done, what would be a common sense solution for you?
Transparency on law enforcement side, and education on the law enforcement side to educate the public on exactly what we do. Every agency in Pennsylvania has a use of force policy. They may call it a model, options, whatever, different terms, different agencies. Just making sure that everyone kind of understands we are human beings, we are people, we make mistakes. When we go out and we do these things, we're going out to do the best job we possibly can. But like anyone, we get scared. If we're going to a situation where we're dealing with somebody that's potentially armed, we have information from reliable sources that he's armed and he's trying to do harm to somebody else. We have that obligation to step in, protect the community, protect the public, protecting ourselves and our coworkers, and letting them know that we are exactly who we are, what we are, and we're there to help. SWAT teams, they're about saving lives, and that's happened so many times. The rare occasion that we do something where we do make a mistake, look at the big picture, see what was there, see what caused the error. Again, if it was something that was reasonable, and that's really what the courts use, is that term reasonable. If the officer's actions were reasonable, it's not that they get a pass. If they've taken another human being's life, they're not getting a pass. They got to live with that. Right. And we see officer suicide associated with that. So there's a lot of different things going on with this. But those are some of the things that I would really look at doing right out of the gate.
Okay.
When you look at society, and something that he kind of talked about is all these situations where people challenge the authority. There is a due process that is in place. In the majority of places, you're going to see that. So if they do something wrong, they'll have an opportunity to say, hey, I was wronged, I can sue you, criminal charges, whatever.
Great, thank you. I'd like to thank our guests tonight, William W. Lawrence, Sergeant Tim Stringer of the Penn State University Justice and Safety Institute, and Tracy Small, the coordinator of the Center County Crisis Intervention Team. I'm Matt Jordan, Associate Professor of Media Studies at Penn State, and on behalf of the team here at WPSU, I'd like to thank you for joining us for the first Talking Together About Guns program. Join us again on April 13th when we will discuss the film Armor of Light. Good night.